Worcestershire sauce, sometimes known as Worcester sauce, is a savoury sauce that is often added to meat and fish dishes, or if you like alcoholic beverages like the Bloody Mary cocktail, it can be added to that. It may or may not, depending on how much research you do on your sauce choices, surprise you to learn that it's literally made from fermented fish and spices. Yes, when you order a Bloody Mary, you're pretty much asking the guy behind the bar to pour aged fish juice into your vodka. It probably won't surprise you to learn that Worcestershire sauce is English because, of course, rotted fish sauce is English. Rotted fish sauce possibly being the most British food-related phrase ever uttered on this channel. The sauce is made from anchovies fermented in vinegar. Now, if that sounds disgusting, we're just getting started. After around 18 months, yes, months, the anchovies should hopefully be fermented enough to be little more than a fishy puree. When they have the puree, they throw in garlic, onions, chili peppers, salt, sugar, and a big pile of natural flavorings. After they have this mixture, they either add water and bottle it, or ship off the concentrated fish paste mixture in big barrels so other people can add water to it. If you're wondering what those natural flavorings are, even though the main ingredient is literally year-old rancid fish, Lee and Perrins, and later Heinz, after they bought L&P, have never revealed the exact mixture they use. This is, of course, probably more to do with the fact that someone else could steal their recipe and make their own sauce than people thinking the mixture was disgusting. However, according to rumors and rumblings that have happened over the years, lemons, soy sauce, pickles, and something known as devil's dung are all supposedly used because, of course, something called dung could be used to improve the flavor of vinegar and congealed fish remains. As for why the mixture is called Worcestershire sauce, that's a decidedly much simpler issue. It's because the sauce, most likely adopted from a recipe from India, was originally made in the English city of Worcester around 1840. The city of Worcester just so happens to be smack bang in the middle of Worcestershire. So that's it. Mystery solved, and in only a few minutes. Boy, do we wish that all of our videos were this simple. But wait a second, because there's more. Back when Worcestershire sauce was first created in roughly 1837, the exact date isn't known, by chemists John Wheely Lee and William Perrins, Mr. Lee and Mr. Perrins, it was marketed as something quite exotic. The sauce was supposedly created from a recipe handed down by a member of the English nobility known only as Lord Marcus Sandys, who apparently learned the recipe while serving as the governor of Bengal. It probably comes as no surprise that no one by that name ever served as the governor of Bengal. On top of this somewhat fantastical claim, Lee and Perrins claimed that their sauce also served as an aid to digestion, as rancid fish is of course wont to do, and that it was effectively a great medicine. As you've probably guessed already, this is all hogwash, which, to be fair, was probably one of the original ingredients when they were experimenting with versions of the recipe for the sauce. Another fishy claim made by the pair was that they first made the sauce at the bequest of someone rich and powerful because, hey, why not? Unfortunately, they claimed the first batch was awful. It was apparently much too strong, so much so that instead of throwing it away like a normal person, they left the barrel with the sauce in their basement. When they came back many months or a couple of years later, depending on the version of the story you read, and saw the mixture of fish paste they'd forgotten to throw away, they decided to stick their finger right into it and see if it tasted any better than it had originally. For some reason, rather than dying of stomach cramps on the spot, they were fine and the mixture actually tasted awesome, and thus the sauce we know and love was born. Whatever the real story of how they come up with the sauce, it is noted that a Roman sauce known as garum was made from fermented intestines of small fish, and other anchovy-based fermented fish sauces were around in Europe as far back as the 17th century. Mr. Lee and Mr. Perrins quickly displayed their business acumen by paying to have ocean liners out of Britain take barrels of their sauce on board in the late 1830s. When the passengers tried the sauce and realized that it was totally godlike, they'd buy a bottle and take it with them. The ingenious part being that thousands of their bottles of sauce were now in cupboards across the globe, just waiting for people to try it and become hooked. The plan worked perfectly, and by 1866 the pair were able to sell their chemist shop to instead sell aged fish sauce full-time due to the worldwide demand for it. Truly, they were living the dream, a fishy-smelling dream, but the dream nonetheless. There's a reason there's the expression busy as a bee. These buzzing insects' entire lives are dedicated to making sure the hive keeps humming and the next generation of bees are born. Worker bees are consistently building, cleaning, and protecting their home. When they are not tending to the hive, they are out foraging for food to feed the queen and the drones. This food is a mixture of pollen, nectar, water, and plant sap, which is eventually transformed into a honey. This is a favorite treat for both humans and bees alike. With vegan diets on the rise, rules and questions around this particular lifestyle are constantly being talked about. Perhaps one of the most debated issues among vegans is the question of honey. By nearly every definition, honey is an animal byproduct created through chemical processes. First, the worker bees go out into the world to forage for the sugary fluid secreted by plants that's known as nectar. Traveling up to 6 miles, when the bees find nectar, they suck it up with their long tube-like tongue and store it in a secondary stomach known as the crop. Due to being able to hold its own weight, that's approximately 70 milligrams of nectar, bees can visit up to 1,500 flowers in one nectar-searching trip. When the bee returns to the hive, it disposes of the collected nectar by regurgitating it into the mouth of another bee, who regurgitates it to another bee, and so on until it finally ends up in a honeycomb. This whole regurgitating process allows the nectar to be broken down by the enzymes in the bees' stomachs, which makes it more suitable for long-term storage. When the partially digested nectar is in the honeycomb, bees speed the evaporation process by fanning their wings rapidly. When it's sufficiently dry, the bees seal the honeycomb with a secretion from its abdomen, which we know of as beeswax. Sealed from air and moisture, and thanks to some of its innate properties, honey can last, for all practical purposes, forever, and provides a perfect food source for the hive during the harsh winter months. Of course, it also provides a delicious sweet treat for humans and other animals. Okay, so in 1944, Donald Watson essentially created the modern vegan movement by organizing the Vegan Society. The word vegan was taken from the beginning and ending of the word vegetarian. His motive for doing so was his affinity for animal life, believing in not only abstaining from consuming animal flesh, but also animal byproducts that had brought unjust harm to the animals. As expressed in Watson's original treatise on being vegan, veganism is a way of living which excludes all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to the animal kingdom. It applies to the exclusion of flesh, fish, fowl, eggs, honey, and animal milk. According to Watson, taking honey from a hive hurts bees in that it is essentially stealing a much-needed food item from an animal. Additionally, commercial beehives control the process of honey making, stacking them in removable trays, trapping the queen in a certain part of the hive, and smoking out hives when retrieving the honey. In terms of Watson's original intention, honey cannot be vegan due to the methods used by commercial beekeeping. But there are those who argue that if one wants to truly adhere to the original vegan lifestyle, then eating properly produced honey is okay. You see, since bees produce the honey naturally, cultivating it in a way that doesn't harm the bees does allow it to be vegan. This means constructing hives that are like the ones the bees have in the wild, and then waiting for a wild swarm of bees to make it their home. Additionally, care must be taken to leave the bees plenty of honey for their own needs. There's also no use of smoke, antibiotics, or chemicals on the hives. In order to solve the problem of opening the hives and disturbing the bees, in order to collect the honey, natural beekeepers invented a tap mechanism that allows excess honey to simply drip into a tube and out of the hive. While many vegans abstain from all animal byproducts simply on principle, or at least attempt to, something that is exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, even for the best-intentioned individual, the modern vegan movement that was born in 1944 focused primarily on the suffering of animals as the key point. If honey can be obtained without making the bees suffer in any way, then in theory it could be part of the vegan diet based on these precepts. On the other hand, some vegans think this doesn't matter at all, as it's generally thought that insects cannot feel pain, or at least are probably not consciously aware of it even if their brains do react to such inputs. Beyond this, the minimal number of bees harmed in the production of honey for human consumption is seemingly no more than the number of insects harmed in the production of vegetables, even of the organic variety. From all of this, it's perhaps no surprise that whether honey is considered vegan or not varies depending on one's exact definition of vegan, which in turn varies from vegan to vegan and group to group. For instance, Vegan Outreach and Vegan Action both consider honey consumption to be acceptable for vegans, leaving it as a matter of personal choice, while the American Vegan Society does not. For kids who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, it was sugary cereal commercials that dotted the television landscape, featuring lucky leprechauns, wisecracking droids, and adorable gremlins. A common theme among all of these was advocating these products were a magical part of a complete breakfast, helping to ingrain that idea into our collective mindset. Of course, anyone who has even a modicum of knowledge about proper nutrition knows that regularly partaking in a massive dose of extremely calorie-dense sugary cereal is not at all needed nor advisable in a complete breakfast. So, how did we get here? What did people historically eat for breakfast? And who was the first to claim that eating cereals like mini ETs was a nutritious way to start the day? Well, to begin with, both large groups of people eating breakfast and large groups choosing to skip it is nothing new. While the Iliad and the Odyssey make mention of soldiers and manual laborers eating a meal very close to the start of the day, with items on the menu being things like barley bread, olives, figs, and wine, many in the ancient world did not eat breakfast at all. In fact, as far as a set meal goes, it wasn't uncommon to choose to only eat one large meal towards the end of the day. For instance, according to food historian Caroline Yelton, outside of the aforementioned individuals like campaign soldiers and those who spent their days doing intensive manual labor, many ancient Romans did not typically eat a morning meal. Indeed, they preferred the previous option of having a very large meal sometime in the afternoon around 3 or 4 o'clock. That said, for those Romans who did eat a morning meal, with that meal called jetaculum, it seems they ate things like bread, olives, raisins, cheeses, and nuts, washing it down with some sort of wine-based beverage, somewhat similar to the ancient Greeks. As for the legionary on the go, they ate things such as porridge made from wheat and barley which was soaked in water. In all cases, this was essentially pre-prepared or quick-to-make and eat food that provided what the body needed to sustain high energy output throughout the morning. The trend toward abstaining from breakfast at all saw a huge upsurge during the Middle Ages, with many opting for a 2-meal system, one around noon and one in the evening. Eating a meal shortly after walking during this period in the Western world seems to have been largely considered a form of gluttony, as noted by 13th century priest Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. That is not to say that nobody ate breakfast, however, even in this anti-breakfast era in the Western world. Those requiring a lot of calories to get through the day generally ate things like rye bread and beer in the morning, though it appears the more devout of these individuals tended to take their desire for a morning meal as a sign of moral weakness, and their giving into it as something of a sinful act. Unsurprisingly, given manual laborers tended to be poor, beyond being considered somewhat gluttonous, eating breakfast in this era also tended to be looked down upon by the affluent as something only poor people did. It was also during this time that the midday meal, which, as mentioned, for many in the Western world was the first meal of the day, was actually called dinner. This is from the Old French word disnar, which meant breakfast. So, in other words, lunch was breakfast and it was called dinner. It was during the 14th and 15th centuries that adding a meal between last night's feast and the midday one started coming into fashion for all classes. In fact, the English word breakfast dates back to the mid-15th century, when it, unsurprisingly, literally meant to break the fast between 2 meals. Within a few centuries, breakfast became normalized, and there are records of it being pushed as the most important meal of the day, going all the way back to the early 18th century, with those who could afford such items eating things like eggs, tea, and coffee, along with classic breakfast items like bread, nuts, and fruits. In fact, by the mid-18th century, certain of the English elite even started building designated breakfast rooms. This finally brings us to the 19th century and the more direct genesis of the sugary breakfast cereal we have today. It was in this era that many Americans were suffering from dyspepsia or indigestion, seemingly caused by a high-protein, high-fat diet largely composed of fatty meats and not nearly enough fiber. Symptoms of this included upper abdominal pain as well as bloating. To combat this and other real and perceived ailments, alternate breakfast items began popping up, generally attempting to avoid meats and animal fats altogether. On top of this, with the Industrial Revolution, breakfast became less about socializing and more about quick consumption. The factory workers needed their caloric intake but didn't have enough time to prepare or eat a full sit-down meal. And this is where breakfast cereals enter the picture. The first modern designated breakfast cereal, forms of porridge aside, was invented in 1863 by a vegetarian Christian abolitionist doctor who was called James Caleb Jackson. Created for his sanatorium patients as a healthy start to the day, it was comprised of crumbled, twice-baked graham flour, which is essentially a type of non-bleached, all-natural, finely ground whole wheat flour, and bran, hard outer layer of the grain, he called granula. The end product resembled a much hardier version of the modern grape nuts, but with significantly larger nuggets. This breakfast substance was so hard that apparently it needed to be soaked in liquid for at least 20 to 30 minutes before it could comfortably be bitten into. In the 1870s, Dr. John Kellogg ran his own sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was known for his very strange, sometimes sadistically abusive methods, including electrically shocking children's genitals, applying forms of acid to them, removal of the clitoris in females, and circumcising males, all in an attempt to prevent masturbation and sexual urges. Interestingly, the latter male circumcision treatment, as something commonly performed in America, actually hails from this era. The modern non-Jewish, non-Islamic practice of foreskin removal was not really a thing in the Western world until it began to be seen as a way to prevent masturbation. You can see our video, Why Do Men Get Circumcised, for more information on that. In any event, Dr. Kellogg visited Jackson's retreat and was most impressed with his granula, so impressed in fact that he ripped off the idea, creating his own version of it made from wheat, corn, and ground oats. He uninventively called it granula, and as a result Jackson sued and Kellogg was forced to rename his cereal to granola. A few years later, a failed Battle Creek suspender salesman named Charles W. Post partially knocked off Kellogg's product and started selling an exceptionally similar granola product that he called Grape Nuts, claiming that it could make one's red blood redder. As with Jackson, Kellogg and Post both pushed this food item as an ideal, healthy food to start the day with. This set the trend that has continued through today for this type of product. Between Kellogg and Post at the turn of the 20th century, Battle Creek became a battleground for two companies that would come to define the world of breakfast cereal. For instance, legend has it that due to a mishap making a batch of the original version of Graham crackers, originally created by Presbyterian minister Sylvester Graham as a way to curb sexual urges, John Kellogg and his brother Will invented a product they unimaginatively dubbed cornflakes. Post was a little more flamboyant, naming his version of the same thing Elijah's manna. This was meant as a striking allusion to the biblical story about the food that saved the wandering, starving Israelites. With the famed prophet sitting on a rock and hand-feeding a raven on the front of the box, Elijah became the first cereal mascot. However, fairly quickly religious groups protested, and Post changed the name to Post Toasties. Ultimately, the Kellogg brothers split over Will Kellogg's decision to recommend adding sugar to cornflakes to help it sell better. This was something that Dr. John Kellogg found borderline blasphemous. In his opinion, it encouraged sexual excitement. The two parted way, with Will founding the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, which went on to become the now billion-dollar Kellogg Corporation. Kellogg, besides their tasty flakes, were soon to also introduce another breakfast staple, Rice Krispies. His brother John Kellogg stuck to his original principles and continued to dedicate his life to ridding the world of such evils as masturbation. Now, given the ladies of the house at this time tended to be the ones who decided what the family would eat, during the first few decades of the 20th century, cereal advertising was primarily aimed at housewives. Kellogg's told women to wink at their grocer and see what they got, and the answer, of course, was a box of cornflakes. Quaker Oats likewise sponsored radio dramas and midday radio shows aimed at housewives. Post told mums that bringing up kids on their cereals would help them later in life. In the late 1930s, as breakfast cereal became more established and commonly purchased anyway, cereal companies started thinking that it might be best to avoid the middlewoman and instead market directly to children who presumably would then pester their mothers to buy the cereal that they wanted. For instance, in 1936, a Dennis the Menace-like character named Skippy was used specifically to market Wheaties to children. The problem here is that children tend to not like straight bran or wheat, but they sure do love sugar. In 1939, the first pre-sugar-coated cereal was produced, called Ranger Joe Wheat Honeys. Ironically, the product was actually an effort by the creator to minimize how much additional sugar kids commonly put on their cereal by including a relatively small, regulated amount. But instead of curbing the practice of over-sugaring cereal, it eventually resulted in the opposite, starting with Post copying Ranger Joe Wheat Honeys with their own version called Sugar Crisp in 1949. Then, thanks to a major breakfast cereal producer making a version of this, the rest of the industry followed suit. By the 1960s, cereal companies were devoting approximately 90% of their advertising budgets to directly appealing to individuals of the youthful persuasion. This is why it's so common today to have prizes in the cereal box, tie-ins with movies, video games, and TV shows, and products called Sprinkles, Spangle, and Ice Cream Cone cereal. On that note, this is also why adding more and more sugar to breakfast cereal became a thing. As for widespread claims by the manufacturers that these cereals are part of a complete breakfast, technically, the cereal companies are not lying here. Unsurprisingly, given the three primary nutrient groups known as macronutrients that humans need to survive are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, according to the American Chemical Society, a healthy breakfast should consist of mostly carbohydrates and proteins. That's a shocker, I know. And indeed, cereal, even if it's simply a bowl of pure sugar, does contain carbs. So these products can indeed technically be considered an essential part of a complete breakfast, just perhaps not an advisable one given the vast majority are essentially candy, which is cleverly marketed to appear nutritious. Indeed, cereal boxes often have on the side of the packet a big thing showing all of the vitamins that they contain, along with a tiny thing saying the recommended serving size. But indeed, no one follows this and simply pours a huge bowl of calories and sugar. But to be fair, combined with certain other breakfast items in extreme moderation, this staple of the breakfast world could potentially be useful if one leads a very physically active life, instead of just rolling out of bed only to very soon sit at a desk all day and then come home and sit on the couch until bedtime. On that note, perhaps those sedentary, wealthy aristocrats of old were onto something in choosing to skip the morning meal. And for those who led a life full of manual labor, it is perhaps no surprise that some form of grain-based morning meal seems to have been the choice that people made throughout most of recorded history. It's easy, it's quick to eat, and it has a mix of simple and complex carbohydrates which provide both quick and relatively long-lasting stores of energy, all while avoiding too much protein and fat, which, while otherwise essential for life and important for things like maintaining muscle mass, might not sit well when eating mostly that in the morning and then jumping right in to hard labor. And now for some bonus facts. Funnily enough, while you might think products like grape nuts or cornflakes would offer better alternatives to more sugary breakfast cereals, at least in terms of avoiding a blood sugar spike, it should be noted that grape nuts has a glycemic index of 71. For the uninitiated, the GI is a scale showing the effect of a given food item on one's blood sugar levels, with 100 being pure glucose. This is surprisingly higher than sugary cereals such as Fruit Loops with 69 and Frosted Flakes with about 55. For further reference, cornflakes has a mean GI of about 81 and Rice Krispies are 82, while table sugar only has a GI of 60. That being said, good nutrition is a lot more complicated than just looking at a single number, and there is definitely a place for food items high on the GI scale, particularly ones that offer other benefits like lots of fiber and micronutrients. It's just pretty surprising how high the vast majority of breakfast cereals, even seemingly non-sugary ones like grape nuts, are on that index. And now for another bonus fact. In 1941, Cheerios were introduced as a ready-to-eat oat cereal. The name emphasized the main ingredient to differentiate itself from the numerous other brands out there whose products were generally made of things like wheat. Unfortunately for Cheerios, Quaker Oats took offense to their name, claiming the oats part infringed on their trademark. While it is highly unlikely that Quaker Oats would have won in court, in order to avoid the issue altogether, the name was changed to Cheerios in 1945. Members of law enforcement stuffing their faces full of donuts is one of the most enduring stereotypes about the boys and girls in blue. In virtually every media representation of the police that isn't deadly serious, the stereotype is played out in some way. Police Academy, The Simpsons, Family Guy, hell, in Wreck-It Ralph, the police officers are literally sentient donuts. So when and where did this stereotype start?
As to the when, that isn't clear. There are anecdotal accounts supporting the idea that officers commonly frequented donut shops as early as the 1950s, and probably further back for reasons we'll get into shortly. But the general public doesn't seem to have made the connection at this stage, at least not as far as surviving documented evidence suggests. As to why donut shops were, and to a much lesser extent still are, so popular among the police, the answer is simple. Up until quite recently in history, most food establishments, and also the majority of stores, closed fairly early in the evening and stayed closed all night. There were basically two options for an officer working the graveyard shift who wanted a snack and a cup of fairly good quality coffee: diners and donut shops, both of which were regularly frequented by the police. However, anecdotal accounts from officers of the era seem to indicate they tended to prefer the donut shops more. As for the reasons, it is noted that donut shops are slightly better suited over diners for if you just want a snack to go with your coffee, but not a full meal. Perhaps more importantly, the donuts are served near instantly instead of needing to wait for food like at diners. This is advantageous if the officer only has a moment to stop, or otherwise thinks he or she might get called away suddenly, even if they are otherwise planning to stay a while. Another reason officers at this time could be frequently found at diners and donut shops, beyond the coffee and food, is that outside of the police station, they offered one of the only climate-controlled areas to sit down at night, particularly for officers in cities where they walked the beat instead of sitting in a climate-controlled car. This is handy, and so are the tables. On that latter note, even cops working the night shift who had patrol cars appreciated the well-lit place to sit down and do paperwork, which, as many police lament, is a huge part of their job. Though there are a multitude of places now open 24 hours a day, donut shops are still quite popular among police working the graveyard shift for the aforementioned reasons. In fact, during the Boston Marathon bombings, one of the only places in the region that wasn't completely locked down for a time were several select Dunkin' Donuts that remained open to serve the police. However, this donut cop tradition is noted by some younger officers as a generational thing. For instance, in a news report interviewing various officers of the youthful persuasion during National Donut Day, yes, that is a thing, most were quick to point out that donuts were simply too sugary and unhealthy for the modern, more health-conscious officer on the go. Nevertheless, even said officers still occasionally hit the donut shops at night to get good quality coffee on the go. And whether a large percentage of officers still frequent donut shops for donuts or not, as long as some do, confirmation bias and Hollywood will no doubt ensure the stereotype of cops chowing down on donuts at any chance they get will live on either way.
The USDA's first nutrition guidelines go all the way back to 1894. These essentially were moderation in everything, eat a variety of nutrition-rich foods, watch your portion size, and avoid eating too much fat. This is a surprisingly good recommendation given the then state of knowledge about human biology, and it's vastly superior to their changing recommendations over the next century or so, the most famous of which is the food pyramid, which was introduced in the late 20th century. So how and when did the food pyramid idea come about? Well, for that, we need to head to Sweden. The very first food pyramid was a Swedish invention, and it was an invention of necessity more than anything else. Back in the 1970s, Sweden saw its country gripped by high food prices. The government then tasked the Socialstyrelsen, the National Board of Health and Welfare, with coming up with a way to help the situation. In response to this, in 1972, they came up with basic and supplementary foods. In a nutshell, basic foods were foods considered essential to a person's well-being, and supplementary foods were foods that provided vitamins and minerals that basic foods did not. However, it was one Anna-Britt Ansater, working for Kooperativa Förbundet, the Swedish cooperative union, a retail grocery cooperative, who really pushed the idea to the next level. Though the Socialstyrelsen's basic food idea was a good one, Anna felt that it could be improved upon and developed an idea of a triangular model to better visualize the portions involved here. The scheme was officially unveiled to the Swedish populace in Kooperativa Förbundet's annual magazine under the headline "Good Wholesome Food at Reasonable Prices." An important thing to note here is that the Socialstyrelsen, and by expansion the Swedish government itself, sought to distance itself from the pyramid in lieu of using a dietary circle model. This version of the circular model, though useful for representing what foods were important, was criticized for not explicitly showing how much of each food type should be consumed, something the pyramid model did in a simple and visually striking way. Now, if you take a quick look at the original pyramid, you may notice that there are some stark differences with the eventual USDA version. There's a reason for this beyond simply a more modern understanding of nutrition and health. That's pressure from lobbyists and heavy hitters in the food industry. You see, the food pyramid stood to be the go-to standard millions of Americans would base their entire diet around, and billions of dollars were at stake. For example, you may notice that in the earliest 1992 version in America, dairy gets its own section, whereas in the Swedish version it is simply bundled along with other staple foods. This isn't an accident, and subconsciously this suggests that dairy products are an essential part of one's diet, which is obviously not true, since many cultures throughout history got along perfectly fine without non-human milk, as do vegans and others today. If you are guessing that entities within the dairy industry lobbied hard for this modification, it's generally thought that you're absolutely correct. You may also notice that the original American pyramid suggests 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta per day. According to the leader of a group of nutritionists who developed the initial version of that food pyramid for the United States, Louis Light, this was due to interference from food industry giants as well. Light went so far as to state that the pyramids the nutritionists created ultimately got, to quote her, sold to the highest bidder. She goes on to state, "When our version of the food guide came back to us revised, we were shocked to find that it was vastly different from the one we had developed. As I later discovered, the wholesale changes made to the guide by the Office of the Secretary of Agriculture were calculated to win the acceptance of the food industry. For instance, the Agricultural Secretary's office altered wording to emphasize processed foods over fresh and whole foods, to downplay lean meats and low-fat dairy choices because the meat and milk lobbies believed that it had hurt sales of full-fat products. It also hugely increased the servings of wheat and other grains to make the wheat growers happy. The meat lobby also got the final word on the color of the saturated fat/cholesterol guideline, which was changed from red to purple because meat producers worried that using red to signify bad would be linked to red meats in consumers' minds. Where we, the USDA nutritionists, called for a base of 5 to 9 servings of fresh fruits and vegetables a day, it was replaced with a paltry 2 to 3 servings, changed to 5 to 7 servings a couple of years later because an anti-cancer campaign by another government agency, the National Cancer Institute, forced the USDA to adopt the higher standard. Our recommendation of 3 to 4 daily servings of whole grain breads and cereals was changed to a whopping 6 to 11 servings, forming the base of the food pyramid as a concession to the processed wheat and corn industries. Moreover, my nutritionist group had placed baked goods made with white flour, including crackers, sweets, and other low-nutrient foods laden with sugars and fats, at the peak of the pyramid, recommending they be eaten sparingly. To our alarm, in the revised food guide, they were now made part of the pyramid's base, and in yet one more assault on dietary logic, changes were made to the wording of the dietary guidelines from eat less to avoid too much, giving a nod to the processed food industry interests by not limiting highly profitable fun foods, junk foods by any other name, that might affect the bottom line of food companies. While it's always important to note that correlation does not equal causation, and there likely were many other factors at play here, it's somewhat humorously pointed out by the Wall Street Journal that obesity rates have increased ever since the introduction of the food pyramid, aka the day millions of people suddenly thought eating 11 billion slices of white bread and crackers per day was healthy. This all brings us to 1995, when the pyramid was revised again. At the time, the USDA was under pressure to alter the wording of the pyramid to say, eat less salt and sugar. The sugar industry, however, fought this change, and when the revised pyramid was released, it advised people to eat less salt but moderate their sugar intake. The funny part is that consuming excessive amounts of sugar regularly is most definitely bad for you, but on the sodium side of things, the number one reason most say to maintain a low sodium diet, that high sodium equals high blood pressure and thus higher chance of heart disease, based on the summation of research to date, doesn't actually appear to be correct. For the full story here, you can see our video, Is Salt Actually Bad for You? But in a nutshell, despite almost every major health body in the world recommending lowering salt intake as a way to reduce chronic unusually high blood pressure and thus instances of heart disease. This has actually been an ongoing contentious issue in the medical field for almost half a century, owing to the general lack of evidence that this is actually happening. As Dr. Ronald Baer et al. Noted in their 2012 paper Salt and Public Health, after a careful consideration of the debate over salt, we have concluded that the concealment of scientific uncertainty is a mistake that serves neither the ends of science nor good policy. To briefly sum up why this is so controversial, despite, again, pretty much every major health body recommending low salt intake to improve health, in 2011 two Cochrane reviews found no evidence that low salt diets actually do this. They concluded, after more than 150 random clinical trials and 13 population studies without any obvious signal in favor of sodium reduction, another position could be to accept that such a signal may not exist. So at this point, if you're wondering what you should eat, Harvard for a time put out their own version of the food pyramid that was actually based on good science instead of lobbyist pressure, and has since, along with the USDA, switched to a plate diagram version, showing essentially the ratios of different things that you should put on your plate, though not the specific amount, as this varies from person to person based on a variety of things like their physical activity level, what type of workouts they do, if any, as well as their height, lean body mass, etc. Unsurprisingly, their recommendation mostly comes down to about half of what's on your plate being fruit and vegetables, and they humorously note that potatoes and french fries do not count as a vegetable. Very disappointing, I know. A quarter should be healthy proteins from things like poultry, fish, beans, and nuts, but you should limit red meat and cheese and avoid processed meats altogether. They also note that in cooking you should always use oils made of mostly healthy fats like olive oil. It's also interesting to note that the latest USDA MyPlate recommendation actually mostly mirrors the Harvard recommendation, with the major divergence being that they still have dairy as its own essential group and even explicitly state the amount of food from the dairy group you need to eat, again emphasizing that you need to eat dairy to eat healthily. In truth, what people actually need on a high level are protein, carbohydrates, and fats, and a bunch of different vitamins and minerals and the like. These can be consumed from a variety of sources, the best of which are more or less outlined in both Harvard's plate and the USDA's, just with the USDA explicitly stating to get what you need here, you need to eat dairy products, which isn't true at all, and I'm sure the dairy industry had nothing to do with the decision to make sure that it's got its own group on the USDA's MyPlate.
Inventing margarine. Odds are you probably have a stick or a tub of it sitting in your fridge right now, but do you have any idea how margarine became a staple in most kitchens? It turns out margarine has a long and controversial international history and can even boast the involvement of Emperor Napoleon III in its invention. Margarine derives its name from a discovery in a chemist's lab in France in 1813. Scientist Michael Eugene Chevreul uncovered a new fatty acid that he decided to call acide margarique. His discovery consisted of shiny pearl-like droplets, so margarites seemed like an apt name, as it is the Greek word for pearly. Several decades later, Napoleon III was pondering the fact that not only the poor people in his empire, but also his armed forces could certainly use an affordable substitute for butter, so he offered a reward to anyone clever enough to come up with a suitable, cheap replacement. A chemist named Hippolyte Mege-Murier rose to the occasion, inventing a substance he dubbed oleomargarine, which was later shortened to margarine. By 1869, Mege-Murier had patented the process for creating margarine that won him Napoleon's prize. His oleomargarine was comprised primarily of beef tallow, salt, sulfate of soda, gastric juices of a pig, and a little cream, all heated and mixed into a butter-like substance, though in truth at this stage it was more of a jelly than what we think of as margarine today, but it kinda tasted like butter at least. Despite winning the prize, the product never really took off. Mege-Murier sold the patent to a Dutch outfit called Jurgens in 1871, which spawned Unilever, still the leading manufacturer of margarine to this day. This company improved on Mege-Murier's technique and created an international market for margarine, building factories in Germany, Norway, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and England. The Dutch businessmen also realized that if they were hoping to sell their product as a butter substitute, it would be helpful for margarine to look as much like butter as possible. Besides improvement in texture, they also had to fix the color. You see, margarine is naturally white, thus they began dyeing it slightly yellow to match the faint yellowish tinge butter naturally has. Of course, today many butter makers also dye their butter to make it a much deeper yellow than is natural, as this is what people have come to expect. The war between butter and margarine had begun, as Mark Twain recorded overhearing from a businessman around the turn of the century on a riverboat in Cincinnati. "Why, we are turning out oleomargarine now by the thousands of tons, and we can sell it so dirt cheap that the whole country has got to take it. Can't get around it, you see. Butter don't stand any show. There ain't any chance for competition." This particular businessman didn't take into account dirty politics. After buttering up various politicians, the dairy industry convinced them to pass the Margarine Act of 1886, which put a 2-cent tax, about 50 cents today, on every pound of margarine sold. Within 2 decades, that was raised to 10 cents per pound, about $2.61 today. In Canada, the situation was much more serious for margarine fans. Margarine was made illegal from 1886 to 1948. Around this same time, particularly in the US states where the dairy industry held great sway, dyeing margarine yellow became illegal to further discourage sales and keep people hooked on butter. In a few states, it even became the law that margarine sold in those states had to be dyed pink. Nefarious advertisements were also run, such as one in a 1911 edition of the Chicago Tribune, where it showed arsenic, tin cans, and cats being thrown into a vat with a few other ingredients, where it was all mixed together to form margarine. Various rumors were spread about what went into making margarine, even though essentially margarine and butter weren't all that different at this point, with both containing about 80% animal fat and 20% water. The fats involved here were even predominantly from the same dairy animal. However, the popular main type of fat used in margarine was about to change. The lack of available beef fat, coupled with new techniques in the hydrogenation of plant materials, made the use of vegetable oils in the formulation of margarine not only possible for the first time, but much more economically viable. Between 1900 and 1920, oleomargarine was made with a mixture of animal fats and vegetable oils. The Great Depression, followed by rationing during World War II, led to a further reduction in the supply of animal fat, and by the mid-40s, the original margarine had almost disappeared from grocers' shelves in favor of the vegetable oil version. These events, particularly World War II, also helped spur the popularity of margarine as butter shortages abounded. By 1950, this surge in popularity resulted in the old extreme tax on margarine predominantly going away, for the first time since the beginning, putting margarine on a level playing field with butter. There still was the colouring issue for a few years longer. From the beginning, the margarine manufacturers retaliated by packaging their product complete with a packet of yellow dye included. The intent was for the margarine to be placed in a bowl and mixed with a spoon by the consumer. The downside to this was that the final results were often uneven and could end up as light or dark yellow, or even yellow and white striped. Another method of dyeing the margarine entailed placing a capsule inside of a plastic package of margarine. The package was then needed to distribute the dye, a job usually given to one of the lucky children of the household. In the mid-1950s, like the heavy taxation that was removed a few years before, the artificial colouring laws were done away with, and margarine could be sold in pretty butter-like hues once again. Since then, many efforts have been made to progressively make margarine more healthy, such as including healthier fats and nixing the trans fats that used to be prevalent in the substance. There have also been improvements in flavour to get things even more butter-like. So while the modern versions bear little resemblance to the original oleomargarine, other than usually containing approximately the same amounts of fats and water, we still call it margarine. Oh, and if you're wondering what became of Hippolyte Mage Murier, aside from the prize he won from Emperor Napoleon III, he didn't really profit from his invention. The poor guy died, well, poor, in 1880. Easy come, easy go.
Created roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in China, the earliest versions of something like chopsticks were used for cooking. They're perfect for reaching into pots full of hot water or oil, and were most likely made from twigs. While it's difficult to nail down a firm date, it would seem it wasn't until around 500 to 400 AD that they began being used as table utensils. One factor that contributed to this switch was a population boom across the country. Consequently, resources, particularly for cooking, became incredibly scarce. As a result, people began cutting their food into tiny pieces so it would cook faster. The bite-sized morsels rendered table knives obsolete, as there was very little left to cut. However, they were now perfect for eating with chopsticks, which were also made from cheaper materials and easily made. Thus, a trend was born. The table knife's decline in popularity in these regions at this time can also be attributed to the teachings of Confucius, who was a vegetarian. He believed that knives weren't appropriate to eat with. As Confucius supposedly said, "The honorable and upright man keeps well away from both the slaughterhouse and the kitchen, and he allows no knives on his table." It was due to this that it's believed that Chinese chopsticks are traditionally blunt at the tip and thus somewhat poor choices to try to spear food as you would with a fork. Within about a century of this, chopsticks had migrated to other Asian countries such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. One distinct difference between Japanese and Chinese chopsticks was that the former were made of a single piece of bamboo that was joined at the base. In addition, Japanese chopsticks were originally used solely for religious ceremonies. Regardless of their differences, chopsticks remained popular in both countries and are still the primary utensil of choice. While the early chopsticks were more often than not made of some cheap material such as bamboo, later silver chopsticks were sometimes used during Chinese dynastic times in order to prevent food poisoning. How? It was believed that silver utensils would turn black if they came into contact with any life-threatening toxins. Unfortunately for those engaging in this practice, silver doesn't turn black when it touches the likes of cyanide or arsenic, among other poisons. However, it can most definitely change color if touched by garlic, onion, or rotten eggs, all of which release hydrogen sulfide, which reacts with the silver, causing it to change color. For anyone that has ever had difficulty eating rice with chopsticks, you may have wondered why anyone would choose this particular utensil for consuming such food with. Perhaps one of the earliest table utensils, such as the spoon, would work better here. But you see, in Asia, the majority of rice is either a short or medium grain variety, often with starches that are particularly gummy or clumpy. As such, it sticks together and is quite easily picked up by chopsticks. In comparison, many Westerners eat long grain rice, often highly processed, which is much fluffier and the individual grains are more distinct and, for the unpracticed hand, difficult to eat with chopsticks. There are all sorts of rumors surrounding brown eggs and white eggs. Some people say that brown eggs are better for you and contain more nutrients. Some people think that brown eggs are better for cooking things like quiches, while white eggs are better for cooking things like cakes, or vice versa, depending on who you talk to. We here at Today I Found Out are all about uncovering the truth amongst all of the myths. And so here is the fascinating difference between brown eggs and white eggs. Brown eggs are brown, white eggs are white. Seriously, much like humans, whether the egg is brown or white, they are the same inside, though in the case of eggs, with one minor caveat which we'll get to in a minute that has nothing to do with whether the chicken is a brown egg layer or white. But besides that caveat, a brown egg or a white egg will give you the same amount of nutrition, they taste the same, and they are equally delicious in quiches and cakes. Also, contrary to popular belief, the two also have more or less the same shell thickness on average. If you've previously noted a difference here, this is likely to do with the age of the chicken. Young chickens lay eggs with shells that are typically harder than older chickens' eggs, but this is true for both white and brown egg layers. How the rumors started about brown eggs being better is thought to be because they're often more expensive at supermarkets, at least in the United States. If something costs more, it has to be better quality or better for you, right? Not in this case, and not in many others. Increasing the price of something, sometimes drastically, is an occasionally used marketing trick to get people to think one product is better than a comparable cheaper product. Sometimes that's true, but many times it's not. As for egg prices, brown eggs cost more in part because the hens that lay them usually eat more, which means the hens cost more to keep per egg. You see, white eggs are most often laid by white or light-colored hens with white earlobes, while brown eggs are most often laid by red-feathered or brown dark-feathered chickens with red earlobes. This is not a universal truth, just a general rule. Further, the chicken's earlobes are really the indicator here, not the feathers, but there is a very strong correlation between earlobe color and feather color, so feather color can be a decent indicator too. Ultimately, egg color is determined by genetics, but the earlobe feather color thing is a good indicator. In the end, red-lobed chickens tend to be larger than their white-lobed
counterparts, which is why they eat more. The farmers need to get reimbursed for the extra feed somehow, so they up the price of the brown eggs. This also explains why white eggs tend to be more popular in supermarkets in some regions of the world. White-lobed chickens cost less for farmers to keep, which leads to cheaper eggs, which leads to grocers buying more white eggs to put on the shelves to offer this product cheaper to consumers. White eggs are simply more cost-effective in the general case. There is also a commonly touted myth that brown eggs taste better, and that's why they're more expensive. As noted, the white egg-brown egg taste difference is a myth. But the potential difference in taste from one egg to another does lead us to the one caveat, though it isn't anything to do with the color of the egg. Rather, it has to do with the chicken's diet. Many chickens raised at home are brown egg layers, while most of the chickens raised for commercial use are white egg layers. The different diets affect the taste of the eggs and even the color of the yolk, similar to how diet can drastically affect the taste of meat. However, if you were to take one of those brown egg-laying chickens and raise it on the same food as a white egg-laying chicken, their eggs would taste the same and be otherwise indistinguishable aside from the color of the shell. If their diets are the same, the yolks will even be identical in color. Today, chickens raised for commercial purposes, whether layers of white eggs or brown, are all getting fed the same thing, with perhaps just a slight variance from company to company. If you've had some brown eggs from a neighbor or a chicken of your own that's fed a different diet than commercially fed chickens eat, then there may be a difference in taste. It just doesn't have anything to do with the color of the egg. So if brown egg-laying chickens are more expensive to feed and keep, why do farmers keep them around? The answer is that so many people buy into the brown eggs taste better myth that brown eggs are still a viable business option. As long as people keep buying the more expensive eggs and are willing to pay the marked up prices beyond factoring in the extra feed, farmers will keep raising chickens that lay them. Of course, these days, some of the most hotly debated arguments aren't over white versus brown eggs, but over the superior quality of organic versus not organic eggs, or free-range versus cage eggs. While differences in diet can affect the taste, if you're wondering about quality of the egg or nutritional value, a study done by D.R. Jones et al. Through the Agricultural Research Service and published in Poultry Science in 2010 found that ultimately there is very little difference in the quality of eggs produced in these different ways. The small differences they did find varied without one egg type consistently maintaining the highest or lowest values. So in the end, while there are small ways the composition and taste of chicken eggs can be influenced, the color of the eggshell is not one of them. Before the widespread availability of refrigerators, in certain small rural Russian villages, many people didn't have access to iceboxes either, so they had to find other ways to keep things unspoiled. While there are countless ways to achieve this depending on the food item, with regards to increasing the shelf life of milk, the villagers in this region of the world came up with a rather unique solution that popularly continued into the 20th century. As described by Dr. Albert Lebedev from Memories from His Childhood, their solution was as follows. For small portions of milk to drink, they used to put a frog inside. A small frog over there could prevent the milk from being spoiled. The question you might now be wondering is whether this actually worked, and the answer to that is, well, yes. So now you're probably wondering, well, why? In 2010, scientists from United Arab Emirates University made an announcement that the secretions from certain frog skins have antibacterial and antifungal properties. Using a species native to African countries, they studied the compounds coming off from the frogs, which are known as antimicrobial peptides and are a string of amino acids. After isolating these compounds, they began testing them against various bacterial infections with promising results. In 2012, scientists from Moscow State University decided to take this a step further by breaking down the compounds and studying the individual peptides. In a study entitled Composition and Antimicrobial Activity of Skin Peptidome of Russian Brown Frogs, published in the Journal of Proteome Research in November 2012, and using Russian brown frogs, which are edible and considered a delicacy, they extracted secretions by applying electrodes. What came out was a cocktail of 76 peptides that all had different properties. Michael Zaslov, now a professor at Georgetown University, but formerly a researcher with the National Institutes of Health, said in an interview that what is amazing is that no two frogs have the same cocktail. They're all different and all beautifully tuned to deal with the microbes that these animals face. As promising as the results are so far, many scientists are skeptical of any real benefit coming from them. For instance, Juno Liu, a professor of pharmacology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, stated in a reference to other apparent natural occurring magic antibiotics, "There are natural substances that work in a lab beautifully, but then when you give it to a human, it's totally inactive, or it's toxic." While this all may or may not ultimately be medicinally helpful for humans, beginning centuries ago, certain Russians seem to have been onto something with putting frogs in milk to delay its spoiling. Although I think we can probably all agree that putting a frog in one's milk takes a backseat to the other age-old way to store milk without refrigeration, which was making it into delicious cheese.
Cheese predates written history. Ancient Egyptians loved cheese so much that depictions of the cheese-making process were painted in tombs. Homer's Odyssey talks about how Cyclops stored his cheese. The Greeks and Romans used cheese as a delicious currency. During the Middle Ages, if there was cheese on the dinner table, it meant the family was of at least moderate wealth. While cheese has been around for ages, many cheeses we eat today were invented over the last 500 years. A few were even invented in the United States, Monterey Jack cheese being one of them. So how did Monterey Jack get its unique name? Now, before we get into all of that, we must go back about 300 years to the Spanish monasteries of California. Back in the 18th century, Spanish missionaries began their takeover of California. It was on July the 16th, 1769, when the first Catholic mission was founded at present-day San Diego. Over a 60-year period, starting in 1769, 21 outposts were settled by Catholic priests of the Franciscan order to spread their beliefs among the local population. The second one, established after San Diego, was in today's Monterey, California. The Spanish missionaries very much desired to be self-sufficient, although they didn't quite achieve this, with some financial support coming from the Pious Fund of Californias, established in 1697 by Spain. Later, this would become the subject of litigation between the US and Mexico. They did bring supplies, foodstuffs, seeds, and livestock into California that were never before seen in the Americas. For example, grapes, apples, and figs were grown for the first time in this part of the world at this time. These fruits had originated in Asia, but had come over to Europe before this as a product of trade. Oranges, also originally from Asia, actually were planted for the first time in North America in the Gulf Coast and Caribbean regions about 150 years prior. Approximately in the early 17th century, but made their first appearance on North America's west coast due to Spanish missionaries. Livestock like cattle were also part of the European colonization of America. Arriving in the mid-17th century from Europe, cattle were a huge food and supply, like leather source, for the settlers. Of course, there was also milk from these cows. Any fresh milk that wasn't used was preserved and converted into cheese. In Monterey, the cheese they made was soft, creamy, and light, and it became a part of the Spanish missionaries' regular diet. They called it queso blanco país, or the country peasant white cheese. Hence the Monterey part of the name Monterey Jack, with the town itself named after the Viceroy of New Spain, the 5th Count of Monterey. The latter, Monterey, ultimately derives from the Galician Monterrey, essentially meaning mountain king. Alright, so what about Jack? Well, let's fast forward about 70 years to 1841, when a Scottish immigrant by the name of David Jack arrived in New York. He became a storekeeper with his two brothers who had already been in America. It's not clear exactly what their store sold, but at some point they became army contractors and hosted military personnel, including one Robert E. Lee. Apparently unsatisfied with store life and having heard about the great fortunes to be made in the California gold rush, in 1848 Jack made his way west. Before he left, though, he bought $1,400, which is about $37,000 today, worth of revolvers in the hope of selling them out west to law-abiding and lawless alike. He did exactly that and made a heady profit. His gold speculating wasn't as profitable, though, and like so many others, he moved to San Francisco to try and make ends meet. He became a customs agent and found his way to Monterey on a business trip. Jack fell in love with the Central Coast town and officially moved there, but he struggled. In fact, he went back to Scotland for a year when his father passed away. But he returned, and he was determined to become a rich member of the community. In 1821, Mexico gained their independence from Spain after an 11-year war to earn that right. In order to encourage expansion, the Mexican government continued what the Spaniards had started by issuing land grants or ranchos to individuals. These individuals were allowed to settle, farm, and use the land however they saw fit. In 1846, only 25 years after Mexico's independence, the U.S. Army invaded the Mexican territories of New Mexico and California, and the Mexican-American War began. This wasn't the first time the United States had forcibly tried to take land from Mexico. In 1845, America had annexed Texas. Within 22 months, the U.S. had won the war, and their territorial expansion to the Pacific coast was complete. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo allowed at least somewhat of a conciliatory end to the war. The treaty called for several major concessions on both sides. Mexico was to cede California, New Mexico, and the rest of Arizona to the U.S., plus it recognized the U.S.'s claim to Texas. In return, the U.S. would pay Mexico $15 million, which is about $400 million today, as well as offer citizenship to any Mexican living in those lands, and still uphold the rancho system set out by the Mexican government. While these promises in theory were kept, the United States government found a way around that last provision. U.S. government-run commissions were set up to determine who actually owned the ranchos. The rancho owners were forced to provide documentation, deeds, and records in order to prove that this was their land. Many of them could not do this due to the years that had passed since they gained ownership of the land and the lack of need for documentation in Mexico at the time. Alright, so this is the point where we go back to Mr. David Jack. In 1853, with the US still sorting out all of those land grants, the Pueblo of Monterey attempted to make its claim that the land belonged to the town, not the US government. They hired Delos Rodin Ashley as their lawyer. He would later go on to be California's treasurer and a Nevada congressman. He actually won their claim for them, but demanded nearly $1,000 in fees. The town was broke and it was forced to auction off its lands anyway to pay Ashley. On February 9, 1859 at 5 p.m., the auction commenced. The sole bidders were Ashley and David Jack. They purchased every single inch of land in Monterey that day, nearly 30,000 acres, for $1,002.50. Thus, Ashley got his money from the city and then some when he later turned over his rights to the land to Jack. It wasn't hard to believe that this was some sort of setup. A suit concerning the auction and subsequent purchase went all the way to the Supreme Court and became known as the Rape of Monterey. David Jack quietly profited on his land through farming, grazing, and charging obscene taxes on those who had built on it. He was a ruthless man. Jack acquired even more land and immediately began foreclosing on properties. He did this by posting foreclosure notices on hard-to-find parts of individual properties and in a different language. As in, if it was a Mexican owner, the notices were in English. If they were English-speaking Americans, then those notices were in Spanish. These lands hosted many types of businesses that Jack now owned, including 14 different dairies that were operated by Spanish and Portuguese dairymen within the Monterey lands. Whenever they had excess milk, they preserved it by turning it into cheese, the special Queso Blanco País, or the country peasant white cheese. Well, since Jack co-owned these dairies, he claims that the cheese was his. He slapped his name on it, and he called it Jack's Cheese. Soon the cheese began selling all across California and the West Coast. In order to identify where it came from, people began calling it Monterey Jack Cheese. As you might be able to imagine, David Jack was totally fine with this. To this day, it is still called Monterey Jack, and derivatives such as Colby Jack, which is a mixture of Colby and Monterey Jack cheese, also exist, which kind of are a homage to a ruthless, corrupt Californian landowner who claimed an old cheese recipe as his own. Despite pink slime, chemical preservatives, and sometimes questionable nutritional value, it's hard to argue the basic point that deep-fried, previously frozen, nugget-shaped chicken pieces are at least somewhat appealing to the human taste bud. The common assumption is that McDonald's was the first one to give us these small morsels of food, but, well, that's untrue. No, the story of the chicken nugget begins with Robert C. Baker, a Cornell professor, and the so-called George Washington Carver of poultry. Growing up in the Finger Lake region of New York in the small town of Newark, Baker was poised to take over his family's farm, which grew fruit in the summer and raised up to 400 chickens in the winter. His mother made chicken and biscuits every Sunday, only after she chopped off the head and let it die in a pail first. Said Baker, "Chicken probably did taste different than today, but do you want to put up with that to get the taste?" He was just a young boy when, in 1929, the Great Depression swallowed all of America and hit farmers especially hard. Robert and his family were forced to learn how to save, scrap, and make a cheap meal. This became ingrained into Baker's thinking years later when he was attempting to figure out ways to create meals that provided the most amount of food and nutritional value for the least amount of money. He attended the local college, Cornell University, in 1939 and majored in pomology, the study and cultivation of fruit. The US officially entered into World War II in 1942, but Baker was exempted from the draft due to his college studies. He graduated in 1943 and went to work for the Cornell Cooperative Extension as a liaison between the university research centers and local farm communities. As the war wound down, so did the demand for chicken. Production supplies, food, and machines increased significantly across America during World War II, literally pulling the country out of the remnants of the economic depression. During this time, poultry farmers had developed ways to grow their output, including advancements in feed and genetics. When the war ended, farmers didn't want to decrease production and sacrifice money in their pockets, so they had to find ways to increase the market for chicken. For years, chickens were only sold whole, making it inconvenient and inefficient for the common household. It was too big for one person to eat, but not generally big enough for a whole family. Additionally, beef and pork were sold in cuts, making them a much more convenient product. Chicken sat third in the American meat hierarchy, behind cow and pig, perhaps not surprising given that chickens appear to have been originally domesticated not for food, but for cockfighting. In any event, Baker had begun to develop more of an interest in the other aspect of his family's business, chicken raising. He worked with the National Poultry Improvement Plan, an organization created in the 1930s whose first task was to combat pylorem disease that caused nearly an 80% mortality rate among baby chickens. He went on to earn a master's in marketing from Pennsylvania State University and was hired soon after by Cornell as an assistant professor in poultry science. He was tasked with finding ways to encourage people to eat more chicken. Under this task, Baker became a local celebrity with the development of his Cornell chicken, a delicious grilled chicken recipe that included vinegar, oil, egg, and barbecue sauce that he developed while at Penn State. He sold his chicken himself at the New York State Fair, and to this day you can still get Cornell chicken at the yearly end of summer fair. In 1957, Baker became the head of the new Department of Food Science at Cornell. With that, he earned himself a lab in which he could develop, test, and taste new chicken products. His lab was stuffed with grinders, blenders, and deboning machines in order to help his research. Among the products he created included chicken bologna, chicken sausages, chicken hot dogs, and chicken patties. Some of it, according to his wife, was really bad. He helped invent the broiler chicken, a 2 to 3 pound chicken more attractive to consumers and quicker to produce for farmers. His work even involved making eggs more attractive to consumers, turning them into treats for children with a product called Kids Pack Egg Carton, and developing a recipe for French toast with extra egg. Baker's backgrounds in marketing also allowed him to develop advertising campaigns, create splashy packaging, and track sales. For his efforts, the New York Times would later call him something of a chicken Edison. More importantly than the products themselves was what Baker developed to create these products, a method that processed chicken, which allowed the meat to be shaped in any way possible. This came in handy for Baker's greatest chicken invention, the chicken stick. In 1963, working with a student of his, Joseph Marshall, they figured out how to keep ground chicken meat together without a skin while keeping a delicious batter attached to the meat. First, they put raw chicken in a grinder with salt and vinegar to take out the moisture. Next, they added powdered milk and mashed up grains. This kept it all together. Then they molded the processed chicken into a shape, in this case a stick, froze them, dipped them in egg batter and cornflake crumbs, and then froze them again, this time to -10 degrees. This whole process kept everything together, and of course it tasted pretty good. They developed a package and put it in the local freezer shelves. Within 6 weeks, they were selling 200 boxes a day, and while the rest is Nugget history. But here's the thing, Baker rarely gets credit for his invention. The reason being is that Cornell published the whole process and all of his recipes in the April 1963 issue of Agricultural Economics Research, a publication that was distributed for free to over 500 companies. He also never patented a single product he invented. He was doing this for the greater good. Well, human good, I suppose. He was a bit of a Hitler to chickens. One of the companies that probably did receive the publication was McDonald's, though the company has since said they never made contact with Baker. Said Robert Grivani, a Cornell professor who studied under Baker, he literally gave ideas away and other people patented them. In any event, in 1977, the McGovern Report was released, urging Americans for the first time to eat less red meat. Prepared by the U.S. Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, which was led by former presidential candidate George McGovern, the report suggested that citizens, to quote, decrease their consumption of red meat and increase consumption of poultry and fish. McDonald's, considering their main product was red meat, suffered because of this. Burger sales dropped, and the company immediately went to work on developing a new product that kept patrons coming through those golden arches. While there was no proof that McDonald's stole any ideas from Baker, and even if they did, he never patented it, so legal action wasn't an option, it's generally thought they had knowledge of his research or had seen a version of the product elsewhere. In March 1980, 50 Knoxville, Tennessee McDonald's debuted a new product, the Chicken McNugget. It set sales records, and soon the Chicken Nugget was at every McDonald's worldwide. Robert Baker invented the chicken stick, later reshaped into a nugget, not because he wanted to fatten up America, but because he was trying to find cheaper and more efficient ways to make a meal out of chicken. While he didn't get rich off his profitable invention, he was elected to the American Poultry Hall of Fame in 2004, so I suppose that's something. And now for some bonus facts. An average beef cow, 200 kilograms of usable meat, produces enough meat to make about 4,500 hamburgers at McDonald's. And now for another bonus fact. About 3 billion pounds of potatoes are used to make McDonald's fries every single year. This is about 8% of all potatoes grown in the United States, or 0.5% of all potatoes grown in the world every year. And now for another bonus fact. When the McDonald's brothers sold the business to Kroc, they withheld the original restaurant, giving it instead free of charge to their original employees who worked there. Kroc later managed to force this restaurant out of business by opening a McDonald's extremely close by. And now for another bonus fact. Another little-remembered food wizard was one William A. Mitchell. While working for General Foods, Mitchell invented Pop Rocks, Tang, Cool Whip, quick-setting Jell-O, a tapioca substitute, and powdered egg whites, among other things. All total, he received over 70 patents in his lifetime.